1, 2, check. Check, check, check. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, check.
So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this wonderful public session, which is going to be part of this conference on workforce resilience. My name is Ramaya Krishnan. I'm the Dean of the Heinz College and Faculty Director of the Block Center for Technology and Society. And it's fantastic that we've had this conference on workforce resilience this morning, and now we're going to have this public panel and a public talk on workforce resilience. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you who are here, but in particular thank my colleagues who have organized this meeting, in particular Professor Brian Kovac and colleagues who have worked hard to put this conference together. The Block Center, when we founded this 5 years ago, was created really to offer a space and a bringing together of faculty, both from technology and from quantitative social science, to really understand the societal consequences of technological change. And we now have 150 faculty from around campus and eminent distinguished visitors like Professor Anna Solomon from Utrecht, who visit the Block Center on a regular basis. And the vision for the Block Center has been to not only do foundational research and problem-driven research, but also have pathways to impact. And in this, I think we have really found the partnership with organizations, be they companies, be they unions, be they not-for-profits, and policymakers to be really important stakeholders in this conversation that we're having. And I think today's conference on workforce resilience is such an important and timely topic that I'm really looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Brian Kovac, Professor of Economics, and to come up and join me here. And let me sort of shake his hand and thank him. Thank you, Brian. And to have him address us on an evidence-based approach to workforce resilience. Take it away. Oh, you've got your mic. All right, cool.
I'll take it. Well, thanks so much, Krishnan. And I just wanted to thank Dean Krishnan and Steve Ray at the Block Center for sponsoring today's event, both the academic mini-conference that we just held and then this event today. I also want to thank the other folks at the Block Center, Hannah Graber, Kate Pendrak, Brian Brown, Cole Gessner, and Brittany Calderon, all of whom made all of this actually happen. And this morning, as I mentioned, we hosted this academic mini-conference on changing technological landscapes and workforce resilience. And we learned about cutting-edge research on how certain skills are rewarded in the labor market, how modern job training programs affect workers and firms, and how AI tools can be used to assist workers that are searching for jobs and employers that are searching for workers. And my goal in the next few minutes is to tell you about some of what we learned during that academic session and to place it in a broader context of the evidence on building a resilient workforce. So the US labor force has seen huge shifts during the past few decades, driven primarily by technological change. Just to give you an example of that, US manufacturing output today is currently about almost exactly what it was in the year 2000, and yet manufacturing employment is down by 25%. Okay, so that's clearly driven by changes in technology. The shift has been hugely disruptive in many communities, and workers who personally experience job loss in many cases face really negative consequences. And so I've listed a bunch of research on this topic on this slide, but what you can see is that workers who lose their jobs experience large earnings and wage declines, can experience persistent unemployment. In the longer run, they and their families have lower wealth. Even their children have lower educational attainment. These job displacements can lead to political polarization. And the most extreme outcome here is that workers who are displaced from their jobs face a substantially increased risk of mortality during the few years following job loss. And these are really terrible outcomes that we should care about as a society and as researchers who are working in this area. And we convened this conference today in part because we think that we're entering another period of turmoil in the labor market, with artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies poised to alter many jobs in profound ways that are hard to predict. And in some areas, this has already happened. So for example, many corporations have legacy computing systems written in old-fashioned computer languages like COBOL. And a bunch of us are working on some research projects, and we're recently talking to folks working in this area. And what they told us was that to convert one of these old-fashioned systems to a modern programming language like Python and put it up in the cloud so that it can be easily maintained would previously take a team of 15 software engineers 6 months to complete. And because of the emergence of new AI tools that can translate code between different software languages, the same job now takes a team of 3 people less than a month to complete. So that's a huge change in the amount and type of labor that one needs to accomplish this kind of important task. And it's clear that many jobs will change in significant ways, and many workers will be performing different tasks and will need to take on entirely different roles following these kinds of changes. For example, this morning, David Deming from Harvard presented a paper showing that economic decision-making ability is heavily rewarded in the labor market, even more so than other cognitive skills, the kinds of things that might load on like an IQ test. And as AI takes over many of the implementation tasks that many of us do in our jobs, what will remain for many of us will be the decision-making tasks about, well, what things should we be implementing? And so these kinds of decision-making and resource allocation skills that Professor Deming was focused on are going to be even more important over time. So we're here in the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy, so we should ask what kinds of policies can help facilitate these kinds of transitions that are on the horizon and help workers thrive in a changing technological landscape. There's a large and long-standing body of evidence on active labor market policies that are designed to support workers. And there are so many literature reviews of this very large body of evidence that you could do a meta-analysis of the meta-analyses at this point. And a common finding across all these meta-analyses is that there's wide variation in the estimated impacts of these programs. In other words, some of the programs work really well and some of them work terribly, and it's not entirely clear why, because they look similar to us as researchers in the data. One likely possibility is that the details matter a lot in how these programs are implemented, but those implementation details are hard for us to measure. But despite this wide variation in effects, there are a few features that stand out to me. So first of all, when I was in grad school in the late 2000s, economists had essentially given up on the idea of classroom worker training as a potential intervention to help workers deal with technological change. The evidence looked really grim, on average very ineffective. But things are looking a lot better in recent years, and that's true for a few reasons. First, if you look at the systematic evidence on these training programs, they take a long time to bear fruit. And so the longer you can observe workers following their completion of a training program, the more likely you are to be able to observe those positive effects which do emerge over time. The early literature only watched workers for, say, a year or so after the training program, and so they look terrible. But once you have a longer data set to follow those workers, you start to find some of these more positive effects. Secondly, we've just done a better job doing our research, frankly. And so we've been able to improve on some of what are known as selection on observables designs, where you just try to control for differences in the workers who get training versus the workers who don't get training, and instead are able to leverage more quasi-random variation that more closely approximates something like an experiment, where you're randomly assigning treatment to one group of workers or another. And third, it looks like we're actually just getting better at training people in some particular ways. In particular, there's a well-known paper by Larry Katz and co-authors who study so-called sectoral job training programs. And these are programs that target specific growing industries and occupations, and they train workers to earn credentials that signal skills that they can utilize at many employers. They impose substantial screening on the way in to ensure that folks are not having difficulties with drug use, that they're motivated to work, and that they have other soft skills that might be necessary for success in the labor market. And they also provide extensive wraparound services both before, during, and after they complete the training program. Another important element is that these programs maintain contact with their prior trainees who are placed in the labor market already, so they can provide feedback on what skills are actually useful, so they can continuously update the training programs to make sure that they stay relevant. And Katz et al. Find that these programs yield large and persistent earnings gains of 12 to 34% for participating workers. And so these are really favorable effects. These programs seem to work quite well on average. And earlier today, Kadim Noray from MIT and the NBER presented research helping us understand why these sectoral job training programs work and for whom they are most effective. So he first confirms these effects that I described a minute ago, but then uses machine learning methods to try to figure out which kinds of workers are experiencing the most positive effects and which are experiencing the least positive effects. Okay, so for whom is it working best and for whom is it working least well? My clicker is working now. Okay, so here's a figure from the paper just showing that there are these large treatment effects. But then when you look for heterogeneity in those effects, what you find is that the effects are least favorable for historically disadvantaged groups. So the effects were smaller for women, for black individuals, for Hispanic individuals, and for poorer individuals. And this finding is concerning because it suggests that although this is a pretty successful suite of programs, it might be leaving behind those that are most disadvantaged. Now, Kadim and his co-author also find that the effects of the training programs depend largely on whether the person gets placed in a high-paying job right after the program. And that depends more on whether they get placed in that job than on their skills measured at the end of the program. Okay, so if you're a worker whose skills really do increase a lot, but you don't manage to find that job quickly, you have much less favorable outcomes than those that do find that job. And this kind of result appears throughout the literature. Quickly getting a good job following an intervention like this seems to be really essential in lots of different contexts. And so here is one more. This is from a randomized evaluation of a job placement program in Colorado, where at-risk workers are placed in a job and their wages are substantially subsidized by the government for a certain amount of time, and then the employer has the option to hire that worker on permanently. Okay, and so what the profiles here show is the black dots here show you what happens to workers who are placed in a job during this period and then are hired into that job permanently. But what happens with these gray triangles here, those are workers who were placed in a job, so they met all the eligibility criteria, but then they didn't get hired into that job. And you can see they fall right back down to looking exactly like the control group, as if they never had that job placement at all. So in this context, getting and keeping that permanent job was completely essential to the treatment effects that they measure. And this relates to a second broad point that I see in reviewing the evidence. Policies that facilitate and incentivize workers to get back to work quickly after a job displacement are particularly effective. This includes things like reemployment bonuses, which pay workers a cash bonus if they get a job quickly and keep it for a certain amount of time following a displacement episode where they're unemployed. It also includes wage insurance, which is a policy under which if a worker loses a job at a given wage and takes a new job paying a lower wage, the government subsidizes a portion of the gap between their old and new wages for a certain amount of time. Full disclosure, I'm a co-author on that paper. And then this Canadian Self-Sufficiency Project is another similar program that has elements of a reemployment bonus and of wage insurance. And I'm highlighting these because in all three cases, they increase employment by so much that workers pay increased taxes and the government saves money on unemployment insurance to the point where the programs make the government money on net. They more than pay for themselves. Okay? And the reason these work so well is because they incentivize workers to get back to work quickly. And they also have the added benefit of facilitating worker transitions, even when those transitions are being made into occupations that we as policymakers and researchers might not have anticipated. And that's important because when you're dealing with technological change like the emergence of artificial intelligence, it's often very hard to know exactly how it's going to play out and what jobs are going to be most favorable in a few years from now, and to target your training in that way. And so these kinds of policies are helpful in facilitating arbitrary transitions, not just into the jobs and occupations that you might have expected. And the idea that training programs might have some mismatch involved is an old one, and there's some evidence that this remains a potential problem. So this comes from a blog post on the New York Fed's website written by Ben Hyman, and it measures the degree of mismatch between the jobs that are posted in a given state and the jobs that we're trained for in that state. And the outlier here that you can see is Ohio, and what it means that that dot is so far down low there is that you had lots of workers in Ohio training for manufacturing jobs and very few manufacturing job openings. Okay? And so the reason I bring this up is that the first point I was making is that these targeted programs actually do seem to work better than we might have thought 10 or 15 years ago, so they're worth pursuing. But it's also worth pursuing broader policies that avoid these kinds of mismatch. So while reemployment bonuses and wage insurance provide general incentives to get back to work, another approach to ensure that training is relevant is to incentivize firms to train their own workers. And earlier today, Lisa Kahn, who's going to be on our panel in a few minutes from the University of Rochester, presented a paper studying the effectiveness of grant programs from the government to subsidize firms to train their own workers. And this has the benefit of the fact that we know that the firms want to hire workers to do those things because they're already employees of those firms. And she and her co-authors found, if you focus on the red line here, that firms receiving these grants expanded their workforce, particularly among entry-level jobs, and it appears that these grants provide access to relatively well-paying firms and relatively well-paying jobs for workers who otherwise wouldn't have had access to those things. So this looks like a successful program. And then secondly, there's another approach to making sure that your vocational training is matching what the labor market actually wants. And so this is from a paper by Anna Solomons, who's going to chair our roundtable in a moment. And the way that things work in Germany is that unions and worker groups and the government have regular interactions, and firms have regular interactions to ensure that their vocational training programs are up to date and are meeting the needs of the workforce in those firms. And what this shows here in the, which one is it? The blue line, is that workers that are facing high technology exposure end up earning substantially higher wages following one of these curriculum updates to the vocational training programs. Okay, so the point of all of this is simply to say that we want to try to put in place policies that can, as much as possible, direct our training toward the needs of the private sector, where we hope workers are going to earn or be able to find jobs, but also to put in place broader policies that facilitate arbitrary transitions that we might not anticipate. So a final point that I'd like to make that emerges from the recent evidence is that while we tend to focus on AI as a disruptive force that's leading to a bunch of issues that workers and training programs need to face, AI can also be used to try to address some problems in the labor market. And so, for example, John Horton of MIT, who will also be on our panel in a few moments, presented work earlier today studying the effects of offering job seekers AI writing tools to help them improve their resumes when they're searching for a job. And workers that were offered the AI tool had an 8% point higher probability of being hired within a month, and their hourly wages were on average 10% higher. Importantly, employers rated those workers similarly after they had hired them, so it doesn't look like providing writing assistance on the resume misled workers, or misled firms rather, into hiring workers whose skills that they didn't appreciate later. There's no evidence for that. So these findings are really encouraging, but another paper that we heard earlier today from Emma Wiles of Boston University used an AI tool on the other side of the labor market to help firms post job openings, to try to help them save time in writing their job postings. And it worked. When you give firms access to an AI tool to help them write their job openings, they wrote more job openings and posted more of them, but they didn't hire any more workers. Okay, so it looked like when you make posting jobs essentially free, firms are willing to do it, but they're not actually willing to create additional jobs. And the problem is that by having these kind of ghost jobs posted on the platform where workers were searching, it looks like it wasted a lot of worker time, to the point where the time wasted for searching workers was much greater than the time saved by the firms posting their jobs online. Okay, so this suggests that these tools can be useful, but the context certainly matters in terms of the overall efficiency of labor markets. And so a final example that I'd like to mention, and then I'll turn it over to the panel, comes from some work from my colleague Lee Brandstetter here at the Heinz College, who has been using AI tutoring systems to try to amplify and broaden the reach of human tutors. There's prior evidence that these human tutors can have really substantial impacts on students, and particularly closing things like racial achievement gaps, but it's extremely expensive. And so what Lee and his co-authors are doing, again, is trying to expand the reach of those tutors to make it so it's more cost-effective and perhaps can be deployed much more widely to help students gain in their achievement. So based on the evidence that we saw today and my broader reading of the literature, I'm cautiously optimistic regarding our ability to identify in-demand skills and occupations and to train workers in high-demand jobs. That said, we should couple those targeted programs with broader programs that help facilitate arbitrary transitions that we might not anticipate. And these include policies that generally incentivize work, like reemployment bonuses or wage insurance, and partnerships with private firms to incentivize them to train their own workers in the skills that they might need. And finally, there's broad scope for ingenuity and innovation in figuring out how to use AI and other emerging technologies to help train workers and assist them in finding jobs that will lead to sustainable careers. And this is an active and dynamic area of research and policy experimentation, and I'm excited to see more from our panel of experts. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Solomons, our panel moderator for this afternoon. Anna is an Institute Gach endowed professor at Utrecht University School of Economics and professor at Tilburg University's Department of Economics. She's also a research fellow at the IZA, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. She is a fellow at our own Block Center and at the Shaping the Future of Work initiative at MIT. Her work explores various labor market topics, focusing on the impacts of technological change and the consequences for earnings levels and inequality, employment and the occupational structure, and skill demand and supply. So join me in welcoming Anna and our panelists.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Brian, for that wonderful keynote and introduction and for attempting to do the Dutch sound. That was memorable. So this, it's on record, right? It's recorded. So this panel, the topic is workforce resilience in a changing technological landscape. I think we just have a great sort of scaffolding for our conversation from Brian. And the objective really is to explore a bit more sort of what both what challenges that brings for workforce development, but also what opportunities maybe lie ahead, and how can we sustain labor market success throughout workers' careers. So let me introduce the collective brainpower we have assembled here to inform on this question. So here to my left, we have Lisa Kahn. She's the Helen F. and Fred H. Gowan Professor of Social Sciences, as well as Professor of Economics at the University of Rochester. She's done very impactful work on the impact of technology on both workers and firms, and has also served on President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors for Labor and Education Policy. Then at the far end, we have Kathy Mail, who's Assistant Vice President and Dean of Nursing, Allied Health, and Social Sciences at CCAC, so the Community College for Allegheny County, which has over 13,000 student enrollment, so a huge school. She's an expert on how technology is changing healthcare practice, as well as the educational programs she manages. Then we have John Horton. He's a professor of information technologies at MIT's Sloan School of Management. His research is focused on the intersection of labor economics, market design, and information systems, and he's done very influential work on many things, but also on how AI is impacting the labor market. And then last but certainly not least, we have Matt Holges, who's the managing director of business development at Catalyst Connection, a nonprofit here in Pittsburgh that's providing consulting and training services to small manufacturing firms, as well as firms in the tech industry. And he's a business development expert with over 20 years of experience serving those industries. So thank you all very much for agreeing to have this conversation. And I should mention, so both CCAC and Catalyst Connection have received a Build Back Better grant from the Black Center to reskill regional workforce here in Pittsburgh through both retraining and curriculum development programs. So I'm delighted to have you. So I think this setup sort of have in mind is have each of the panelists sort of give a bit of an opening statement, which I'll introduce with a leading question. And then after you've gotten some sense of where they're at, open the floor to questions. So anything that's on your mind, feel free to ask. Maybe we'll take a couple, try to bundle them and see what our panelists think. I have a lot of questions. I can filibuster a lot, but ideally I don't monopolize the conversation. So anything that's on your mind that springs up, please feel free to ask. So Lisa, let me share. Let me start with you. So do you share Brian's optimism in sort of how he's talking about these reskilling programs, right? And sort of maybe more generally, what do we actually know about workforce development programs to help bridge skill gaps? Yeah, please help us think about that.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for having me. In some sense, I'm a little redundant to Brian because we're, both labor economists, both very similarly trained, and so I'm, I feel like now I'm preaching to the choir, but I also, come from a similar educational background to Brian, where we were growing up as economists. Public sector training programs just had a very bad name, very pessimistic outlooks. Why would you ever bother with those? Things look so terrible. But on the flip side, I was also trained that we have such a great need for post-schooling human capital accumulation. So we have really big differences in income between somebody who has a college degree or higher and somebody who does not have a college degree or lower. And people really seem to be falling off the traditional pathways, despite the fact that the incentives are all, you should go to college because you will do so much better. We have educational attainment in the US has been stagnating. And so those traditional pathways don't seem to be capturing people, again, despite the fact that they're incentivized to do so. And then furthermore, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today is that the pace of technological change is going to mean that, even if you did have a college degree and a really good skill, you might have to reskill at some point in your future. And then just adding to that, sort of rising income inequality and declining labor force participation, especially for less educated groups, especially for less educated men. It seems as though those groups are just not finding something in the labor market that's going to compensate them enough for their time. They also seem to be fairly cranky about it, and also seem to face dire consequences in some cases, like the mortality evidence that Brian was talking about. So I don't know how you would solve these problems but through workforce development programs or other types of sort of facilitating job matching and the like, which Brian spoke about, I think John has worked on. So that means we do have to get really serious about things like vocational education, which I think sometimes is a dirty word in the U.S. We want to talk about K through 12 and let's push people on that way. But other countries, Europe and in Germany, do a really nice job with vocational education and building it on in. And I think maybe some of the kids that we're losing through the typical track might be able to do better if they saw a better connection between what they're learning and what they can do once they leave school. And at the same time, though, coming back to this idea that public sector programs might be really necessary despite the fact that they haven't been so successful, private sector employers are not really necessarily incentivized to train up their own workers because workers, of course, are mobile, and that's actually a good thing. We want workers to move around to the best jobs, but then an individual employer isn't going to want to necessarily invest a lot in their worker and have them lose out. So I've been working researching programs that actually involve a partnership between the public sector and private firms. So Brian was alluding to this idea that, of course, the private sector knows what skills they want, and large-scale government programs kind of may or may not know what skills employers want. So I think it's really crucial to have private sector involvement, but at some point the government might need to help incentivize the private sector to be doing those things. And I think that there are some areas where there's some optimism, like there's some programs that I think have worked really well and should be scaled up. I also was a little bit pessimistic, on the other hand, by some of the evidence that Brian was showing, because my point of view, I think the skills provision is really, really important, but also just a foot in the door can be really important. Some of my work has really shown light on this idea that an early start in the labor market, it's a very vulnerable time. And so people who can have a good start do very, very well, and people who have a rocky start, that really stays with them, unfortunately, for a very long time period. And so I think the other policy lever that we might have at our disposal besides skills provision is just helping people get a stepping stone into the labor market, and that can be really very important. So it's kind of sad to see that the one program that was facilitating a stepping stone through an unpaid internship did not have lasting impacts, but I think I'd be really interested to learn more about why that is, and maybe we can improve upon those things. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that we can impart skills and they can be productive and valuable for workers and firms, but it may not be enough, it may not work in every setting, and this idea of sort of a slippery job ladder where people try to get onto the first rung but maybe fall off is also an area where I think it's really important to have some focus on. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Great. Thank you so much. I have a lot of follow-ups, but let me first move on to ask Kathy, sort of based on your experience in running these nursing programs. So how are change in technology impacting the healthcare practice today, the programs you manage, and sort of what challenges do you see for the programs to keep up, and how do you think we should face those challenges?
Thank you, Anna. Is my mic on? Okay.
It's on.
So, full disclosure, I'm not really an expert, but I'm going to speak to you.
That's not true.
I'm going to speak to you from my 47 years as history as a registered nurse and what I learned as a nurse, a head nurse manager, a faculty member at Duquesne School of Nursing, and my most recent experience as an administrator of healthcare educational programs. And I don't have any statistics for you, but maybe the experts do. But I only know what I know and what I've experienced. So with that said, I'm very thankful for the technological innovations that I see in healthcare and academia. However, it's like a double-edged sword where that comes with these innovations. So in the healthcare settings, we see the impact of patient safety, a reduction of medical errors, the impact of AI on clinical decision-making and how it's impacted by saving lives. And we've seen better scanning devices to detect problems that you once could not see. And we have surgical technology that can get into areas of the body that we once thought were impossible to reach surgically. I remember my sister who had 3 aneurysms, and they couldn't get to the one aneurysm because it just, at that time, years ago, was not possible. We always had telemedicine in the rural areas, but with the onset of COVID, the use of telemedicine and virtual healthcare delivery and monitoring is really assisting with the management of chronic health problems that we have. And once again, such a great need in the United States. And it brings up the issue of managing health issues even while traveling and being global. So here's some of the challenges that I see. Technological innovations in healthcare most likely will impact the cost of healthcare delivery. So if not covered by insurance, can you afford to pay out of pocket or go on to collections? I have an example of my little grandbaby. You know, she was so excited running, 5 years old, running to get to her tennis lessons, and she ran into a wall, cracked her head open, was bleeding profusely, took her to the emergency room, and you know, they were able to do a new method on her to try to minimize the scarring. And after that, then my daughter and her husband were given this big bill. So, you know, on one side, it's really good, and we really wanted her to be cured and saved, but yet, you know, what's the impact on the family? So that brings up some ethical considerations, issues of distributive justice. And we all know distributive justice is a fair distribution of resources, opportunities, and burdens in a society. And it takes into account factors such as wealth, income, social status. So in some cases, there may be a limited supply of healthcare technology. So the person who can pay the most may get the equipment. So there's lots of issues related to perhaps, you know, if you don't have the money, are you on the bottom? Do you not get the resources? We did this during, you know, I serve on a board of one of the hospitals here. And, you know, during COVID, you know, there was only so many, you know, ventilators and so forth. So we had to go through that decision tree, like who would get it first? What's your decision making for who gets what resources? So it also brings up the issue, just because you can do something, ought you do it? And although technological innovations help save lives, you still need somebody to interpret and act on the information. You know, for example, you know, we now have the electronic health records, and, you know, someone transferring from one institution to another. My sister spent about 4 months in and out of the hospital, but when she transferred from the hospital to the nursing home, then no one read the record to say that her vancomycin was discontinued. So they kept giving it to her. So she went back into the hospital, you know, then they took her off the vancomycin. Then she went to another nursing home. What? They didn't read, didn't interpret, and then they gave her the vancomycin again, restarted it, and ended back up in the hospital, back and forth. So you still need people to interpret those results. And then recent layoffs in the healthcare system, you know, how has AI impacted these layoffs? You know, was that related to that? So in my healthcare educational program, COVID allowed us to be very creative in our ways of learning. We really had to be really creative. We had about 1 week in March of 2020 to change from a in-person learning offering to online modalities. And we really used a lot of support from the companies out there that you already use virtual simulation-based learning platforms. And so we were able to tap into them. We did a lot of training, lots of time consuming in order to do that. So what challenges do we have in our healthcare programs? And I will say that we have about 700 nursing students and about 600 allied health students in our program. I also manage the sciences, and those numbers are very large. But as we try to integrate technology in the curriculum, we have some challenges. There's a cost associated with adding technologies to the curriculum. What does that mean? Program fees are going to be increased, and therefore the cost of education is going to be impacted. So we also have to continually to update our curricula to incorporate the latest technologies, because we have to be competitive with other nursing programs, even though we're 2-year, but we still compete with the 4-year programs. And as you know, that in nursing, it doesn't matter if you graduate from a 2-year program or a 4-year program. It doesn't matter to the State Board of Nursing. We're all under that auspice. And so we all have to make the same, the students have to pass the national board exam. So we want to be competitive, but it takes a long time to train faculty and to train students, and that eats into your offering to your students, your time. So we're a 2-year program. We have to impact all this technological innovations, very time consuming. So I also raised the issue that should this be the focus? You know, technological innovation is great, but how much do you need? And our program, we certainly have all that we need to educate our students. However, our national board scores are very competitive with the university out there. You know, our students, we have to hit an 80% benchmark, but we're at 96.49%. And we've been in the 90s for a very long time. So, you know, once again, you know, technology is great, but how much do you need? So, thank you.
Thank you so much for that very insightful and nuanced take from the healthcare perspective. Let me move down the line to Matt and ask, you know, from your expertise on more the manufacturing sector and also the perspective of small businesses, what is your view on sort of just changing technology and its impact on workforce?
Thanks for sharing your afternoon, everyone. Look, I'll be brief because I'm not a technologist or a futurist or a technology futurist, but I can tell you, and working with manufacturers here in southwestern Pennsylvania, which I do as part of Catalyst Connection, which is an MEP, that stands for Manufacturing Extension Partnership. There's like 60 centers like us across the United States that provide services to manufacturers. We cover 12 counties of southwestern Pennsylvania. We talked a little bit earlier about the loss of jobs in manufacturing, but right now there are 2,700 manufacturers here in southwestern Pennsylvania and more than 3,000 open positions that can't be filled. That's a challenge for a lot of these manufacturers. And there's this talk about technology replacing the worker. I don't necessarily see that. What I see more often than not is technology maybe replacing a task, but not a worker. The opportunity is to move that worker to a more valued position within the company or a more value-added position within the manufacturing process. I also see quite a bit from an AI perspective where manufacturers are beginning to dabble into some of this, getting a better understanding of their data and turning that data into actionable intelligence. If you look at a typical CNC machine, it is spitting out reams and reams of data that previously they were not really taking advantage of, and the opportunity to leverage that to make sure that they're getting overall equipment efficiency and making sure those systems are running more properly and with better quality as a result, with less scrap, so that they can provide products at a lower cost to their customer, and more importantly, meet what's really important to the customer right now, which is not affordability. Price isn't always the issue. It's availability, making sure that they can get the product to the customer on time. You know, a typical manufacturer, when I see their challenges, most manufacturers in this region have less than 25 employees. And where their real challenge is at the end of the month when they have to ship, everybody stops what they're doing and they move off to logistics, right? To make sure that things are getting packaged and they're shipped out the door. Those are the opportunities where many of these manufacturers can take that position, that logistics, packing and shipping, automate that process, and then keep everybody else back on the job, working the machines so they can maintain the throughput that they need. You know, another way that I've seen it in recently is in training. A lot of manufacturers have an awful lot of these training guides that the only time anybody ever sees it, it's the spine of the book that's up on a shelf somewhere. By taking that content down, validating, making sure that it's right, using tools like ChatGPT or others to kind of convert that into better content has been an opportunity for some of these companies, and update their information. And then putting that into different platforms so that maybe they're more visual platforms, so that there's at the fingertips of the person working the machine. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and Siemens had an initiative around converting a lot of their content for training with a goal that they would be able to take somebody from the shipping dock and then within 20 minutes have that person able to do complex assembly on the line. That's where technology can really impact the individual contributor on the floor and really help companies maximize throughput. Another example that I recently experienced, I have a consultant on staff that provides ISO 9001 and AS 9100 services. Now, to be ISO 9001 or AS 9100, a manufacturer has to have a procedural documentation across the board. And when they would engage us, a manufacturer would spend tens of thousands of dollars for a consultant to provide these services to help them through that process. I sat with our consultant and I pulled up ChatGPT, and I was explaining to him how it can really impact a company, how they can begin building this content to make sure that they have it on file. And I said, all right, write me an ISO 9, using a prompt, I prompted, write me an ISO 9001 quality procedure for the calibration of, Craig, give me a tool. He says, a micrometer. I said, okay, micrometer. Seconds, it spells out ISO quality procedural document, and it said, these are the tools that you're going to need, and this is why it's important. And it went down through an entire step process of what a company should be doing. And I turned and I showed him that. I said, is that close to what it is? And he looked at it and he said, yeah, but you don't know if the guy's actually doing that on the floor. And I said, I understand it, but that's where the interaction comes in, right? You take that documentation, you have time with the person that's responsible for that task, and then you make sure that you are augmenting it, making the changes that are necessary. Now you have a cohesive quality document that when you go to get audited, somebody says, yeah, this is exactly how you do it. So I think these changes in technology are exciting. I think that there are certainly a lot of concerns that people have, but many manufacturers are already using these technologies and maybe don't even realize it. They don't realize the fact that their marketing department is basically implementing these tools to generate content. They're curating content online, they're repositioning that content through unique tools. One of the more unique ones I've been experiencing recently has been the Notebook LM, and how much fun that's been for us to take things like our annual report or a guide that we had for CMMC, which was a very complex process around the cybersecurity maturity model certificate, and how manufacturers have to be aware of this timeline to position themselves, and by putting it into this platform was able to generate a 15-minute podcast that allowed anybody to digest that content in a more meaningful way. And then actually I was explaining it to my daughter, and was exciting to me because she's a student at DePaul, and young people will find a better way to use these tools too, right? And ethical ways to use it. She had been studying a course, a section in one of her classes was having difficulty digesting the content. I showed her the Notebook LM. She took a PDF of that section of the book. She dropped it into a Notebook LM. It created a 12-minute podcast that she then went to the gym and listened to it and found a way to augment her learning. And she did that on her own. And it was just amazing to see that. And I think that given these tools, workers in manufacturing, workers in any aspect of any business can really leverage these to do their job better.
Thanks so much, Matt. I feel thoroughly middle-aged after that discussion. But I think it's great that you sort of what you're highlighting, this sort of opportunity for these tools to perhaps transform how we learn, make learning more engaging, make sort of the on-ramp less costly. And I think so that's a great promise. It's great to hear the sort of practical examples that you've already encountered. While we're in an optimistic mood, I want to ask John, maybe tell us a little bit about sort of also the opportunities of this technology and other, it could be AI, could be broader, sort of to help worker career advancement. And, you know, something that Brian also already highlighted in his keynote, and I don't want to paint you in a completely Pollyanna-ish corner here, so feel free to also highlight if you see big obstacles, obviously. So, but thanks very much.
Sure. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. One thing I was kind of struck by talking about the kind of pessimism about active labor market policies, which Lisa and I were kind of like contemporaries in grad school, and I remember this quite well. There was also kind of a pessimism about technology helping the matching process of the labor market. So we've kind of talked a lot about helping workers skill, education, but just, given you have the market, how do you help people find opportunities? There was this optimism around the internet that, hey, we're going to use this to overcome all these frictions. It's going to be super easy to find jobs. And that didn't really pan out. It kind of was a promise that wasn't sort of realized. And so I'm getting negative and pessimistic. And I think, there's maybe a promise now that some of these technologies might let us do some of the things that we couldn't do before. And so I wanted to take a minute just talk about sort of what makes labor markets hard. Also what makes labor markets interesting. But the matching process, if you think about it, just how many people have get, say, like job recommendations from LinkedIn or something? Do you get emails? They're often terrible, right? I hope no one hears from LinkedIn, but I'll get job alerts like, hey, would you be interested in a job in Boston being a professor of ophthalmology? Like, no, that's probably not a good idea. But they're just kind of matching on the keyword, right? And they can get sort of more sophisticated, but you can kind of sense that these recommender systems, they don't kind of function at the level of granularity that you would need to actually make good recommendations. And I think if you went across the economy, I think you find when people sort of really know something about their area, they see all these fine distinctions about different jobs and different skills that we don't really see as an outsider. So say if someone's an economist, you're like, oh, they're an economist. Well, I'm labor, I'm public, I'm finance, but in labor, I'm not that kind of labor economist, right? There's all these kind of fine distinctions that kind of don't get necessarily reflected in these recommender systems. And I think part of the problem is that some of the things that you can do on, say, Amazon, where people who bought this also bought this, these tricks that we have for making really powerful recommender systems, they don't really work in markets where people, maybe they have 10 jobs over the course of a lifetime. And you can't say, oh, people who had this job also had this job. Nope, doesn't work. People typically only have one job at a time, subject to gig economy stuff. I looked at Andy when I said that, so I had to mention that. But the point just being that the data is not necessarily there to do really, really high quality recommender systems so far. The other problem is in labor markets, it's really a problem even of just knowing who's on the market, right? You don't necessarily know who's actively searching for jobs. Someone might be movable, and that's kind of their private information, and they're certainly not going to go to LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm with my current employer, but I'm now looking for new work, but don't tell them, right? There's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't kind of share this information. And markets really fail when there's not the information you need to guide search and to help people make good choices. Another problem with labor markets, most of us can only do one job, and usually a position is sort of for one worker. You can't, in a recommender system, you could say, hey, you're looking for a book to read? Read Harry Potter, kid. Everyone likes Harry Potter, and I can recommend it 1,000,000 times. I can't say, oh, here's this job. It's great for everyone. Everyone should apply for this job. No, it's going to be small numbers, and it has to kind of reflect kind of the supply and demand, and that can be very hard to get right in these recommender systems. So all I'm kind of you kind of thought I was going to say the positive thing. I'm saying all these negative things. let me say where I think some of these things could be helpful. I think if you've used these language models, and I loved your example of a very detailed technical spec, they know a ton about our world, right? Like they have read everything that you can think of. And so they can understand, like, if you have this job now, this is the kind of job that you might be interested in. They can reason about things in a way that you could imagine a much higher quality of recommender system. Not only that, if you trust an agent that's acting on your behalf in a labor market, you might tell them your secrets, right? Preferences that you have that you'd rather not communicate to the platform, certain constraints you have. I was talking to someone, if you're a woman and you're going on the job market, you probably don't want to start your interview asking about the maternity leave policy. Fair or not, you run this risk that you might get discriminated against. But you could imagine having an agent that is a faithful agent that's keeping your secrets, that could do some investigation on your behalf with sort of without tipping your hand. I think there's also I mentioned congestion, and this is difficult to kind of manage. One of the things that I think is particularly exciting, if you look at most labor markets where the stakes are really high, say like professional sports, CEOs, things like that, there's often a whole bunch of other agents helping this process. But it doesn't scale down. Like, we don't get agents, right? Because our jobs they don't pay enough to make it worth it, probably. But if you had a world where agents could take and assist everyone looking for jobs, my agent could talk to your agent at zero cost to kind of suss out opportunities. And if you could do that, right? Like you can imagine a world, and this is kind of getting a little science fiction, but imagine we all had our agents on LinkedIn, and they were talking to employer agents on our behalf and kind of finding out where there might be opportunities and then surfacing them to us. That's not us spending all day long in Zoom calls that aren't going to go anywhere. We might only kind of surface things that are actually like particularly highly valuable. And I think the idea of a faithful, highly intelligent agent that's helping us in the labor market all the time could be a very like promising, exciting vision. So that's what I'm optimistic about. And I think the other thing, it's just participating in a labor market can be extremely time consuming, and you see companies, they're saying like, oh well, we'll have an AI agent that will interview thousands of people for you. No one's going to want to participate in that. No one's going to be like, oh, I'm going to take an hour of my time to be one of 1,000. So what I think you're going to need is systems that kind of reflect the fact that people's opportunity costs are really high, and so we'll have to have things that are sort of that appreciate sort of the opportunity cost on both sides of the market. But I am very optimistic. I think this stuff is going to be huge and impactful.
Great. Thank you so much, John. So now that you all sort of know where our panelists are at and their takes, please let me know if there's any questions that you'd like to ask them, and we'll see if we can address them. I don't know if you have a mic that goes around. Yeah. So just raise your hand and mic will come to you. Don't be shy.
I'm running the mic, not asking a question. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand. Okay. We have Lee up there.
I can even go.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so Kathy, thanks again for being here. I mean, as you know, we've had lots of conversations about the amazing programs that you run at CCAC. And one of the things that's really struck me about those programs, other than the fact that they all boost graduate incomes by more than $20,000 a year right upon completion, and this is for a degree program that costs 11 grand, right, at the most, is how you and your staff are really keeping track of what the clinics and the hospitals are doing and what they're looking for, and you're constantly updating the curriculum to reflect that, right? And what you guys have consistently done is so hard for other training programs to do, right? So I'm going to ask you a question, and it's horribly unfair, right? But what do you think you could tell managers of other workforce development programs that would help them connect and learn from and track employers' needs as well as you and your colleagues have done?
Well, we cannot run a nursing program or allied health program unless we are, we cannot run a nursing program or allied health care program unless we are in partnership with the employer. So we meet with our employers constantly. Some of them, they're like on a monthly basis. We have advisory meetings where we invite the employer in. We ask them questions, what are you doing? What are we doing? How can we best meet your needs? Because we want to put out a product, a person who can step onto their, they need some training, but step into the workforce environment. So it's partnership. We're in constant connection with them.
If I could just briefly add to that, I mean, one of the great things about community colleges is they are tied to the local economy and the employers that are there. And if they can strengthen those relationships, they can build curriculum that is needed for those employers in the marketplace. We find that quite a bit in manufacturing, that the local community colleges have those relationships, have changed their curriculum models to serve those communities, helping to build things, feeders for apprenticeship programs, things like that are very important.
That's great. Just to ask a follow-up to Lisa, because you were mentioning in the conference earlier that the problem with some of the workforce development programs in the past is maybe also been some sort of stigma associated with them. Do you feel like these sort of initiatives that we're talking about now could also, help in that direction, or what's your take on that particular?
Yeah, so I think one piece of the pessimism from the large-scale government programs is that they were actually trying to do a lot of different things, and one of which was to target disadvantaged groups, which is obviously groups that we want to help, but people who had been unemployed for a long time, people who had been previously served time in prison, for instance. These programs became kind of stigmatized because of those participants, and obviously we want to help those groups as well, but a whole lot of people need training beyond just those groups, and they sort of all got lumped together. So these other types of programs with private sector involvement, community colleges just seem like a terrifically agile way to do that. And then that does seem as though it kind of avoids some of the sort of stigma of the program. Of course, less targeted to extremely disadvantaged people, but again, there's a lot of need for these, so maybe it's okay if not everything is so targeted.
Great. We have a question there from Krishna.
Can you hear me, or do I need to go down?
I think you have to go to the mic for the online audience. Thanks.
Well, first of all, thank you for both the opening remarks and a great panel. I guess I had two questions, I guess, related. Is there any comments that the panelists have about the role that technology, in this case AI, could potentially play in creating new opportunities? I mean, in Anna's work with David and others, there's been the introduction of new occupations have been introduced over time. So as you think about training and these opportunities, is there likely some occupations that might change, some that might sunset, but some that might emerge. So that's one. The second is, what capabilities does government need to have better situational awareness to understand what's going on in the labor market? So, I led the COVID task force for the governor. The administrative systems that government has not particularly responsive to knowing what's actually going on in the market, like what ADP and LinkedIn and Indeed and others have, both with regard to job descriptions and payroll. So are there creative ways in which we could endow government with more situational awareness and real-time visibility of what's going on in the labor market by combining what BLS has with these private sector data sources? So 2 questions. One about what's changing and evolving in the marketplace. The other is, how do you give situational awareness?
Great. Please.
I just was going to say on the last point, I actually was doing a lot of this nowcasting during COVID, because all of the data sources that you mentioned were just much quicker than the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the typical government surveys. So it now seems a little silly, but at the time there was like a 2-month lead that, for instance, a data set called Burning Glass Technologies, which has its job vacancy postings, gave us a really terrific real-time look at what was happening in the labor market that we were not going to learn from the Bureau of Labor Statistics until at least 2 months later, if not more, which in most speeds of academic work, 2 months is no problem. But during COVID, everything felt extremely heightened, and it seemed like a time where we wanted to know much more quickly. So I think you've seen, even since COVID, integration of a lot of those data sources. So the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the regional banks are all using these sort of like big data sets to better understand where the economy is going. It's very hard to combine them with the typical government statistics and to really have a very good sense of what you're measuring and what you're missing. But I think that research is coming along as well. So I'm very optimistic about these better measurement sources. And just a plug for economics is we can do all this big data stuff too, but we can also tell you, well, okay, you have some big, huge data set. You're doing all this machine learning on it and everything. Is it representative of what you want to know? How is it different? And you need to go to your economics classes to be able to learn that stuff. So
Lisa's saying we won't be replaced. Yeah.
Never. I think on the first question, it seems like it's common with some new technology that people sort of see the substitution story first, like, oh, I can use this for this. And then the complementarities kind of emerge later, I think, because it's often like you have to redesign a process, or someone has to have that kind of entrepreneurial spark, like, oh, that's what you can use this thing for. I'm not sure how much, I don't have a good sense of like how much that needs to be guided. It does seem with this technology, it can kind of emerge somewhat organically, because it's a technology that is very much facilitates like play. Like you can just play around with these things and see what they do. That's not, say when electricity came around, it probably wasn't a good idea to just start playing around. Your descendants aren't here now. But this, you can play around and you can find out and learn, and you get ideas about how you can apply it to like your particular situation. So I think the complementarity story, it will be there, and it will just kind of take a little time to play out.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
I was going
Matt.
to say, I'm not sure what new positions are going to be created through AI. I think that certain positions can be augmented through it. You used an example earlier about somebody using AI to generate job postings, and it didn't have much of an impact. But through an understanding of prompt engineering, we work with manufacturers all the time about using those opportunities as employer branding. So if an individual takes a typical job posting that they have, say, hey, post a job like this because we have these openings, and it posts the same type of position. Yet if from a prompt engineering standpoint, you say, write a job for this position that talks about our core values as an organization, our culture, and why this is a great place to work, you'll get a vastly different job posting, right? And those are the types of postings that will get more eyes on them, and eventually more people applying for them.
Yeah.
As a co-author on that paper, this is exactly right. Part of the problem was that the people weren't adapting it. It was just too generic, and that kind of harmed them. But I think that had they kind of not done that and sort of do what you're suggesting, it would have actually worked a lot better.
Yeah, and maybe if I can ask you, Kathy, as well, from your experience, so we were talking about new roles, and I think what you earlier said is like, should that be guided? I think academic economists often tell this story, and you tell me how wrong it is, and I'm assuming it's wrong, but you tell me how wrong. It's sort of like the idea is that AI could unlock sort of a different distribution of tasks among healthcare professionals. The idea being that obviously all levels of healthcare professionals are experts in the human body and in diagnosing disease, et cetera, but there's a lot of rules about who can do what tasks. There's a lot of like diagnosis or prescription, et cetera. But with the aid of diagnostic tools, which as you mentioned could really improve patient care, you could maybe sort of more equally distribute, let's say, those tasks that add a lot of value that are also very well remunerated. But I think that would almost necessarily require some sort of intervention in actually what's allowed, right? Or is that in any sense misguided, or do you have a different view?
I mean, I'm very much, if AI can help say what jobs are out there or new jobs and that could be created. At community college, we are always doing strategic planning, looking at the environment, looking at these labor job statistics and see where the job growths are or where it's not. That's how we close some programs. I mean, we're always looking, you have to have that balance. And so we are always looking for new opportunities and growth. So yeah, lots of opportunities. If AI can find a niche or, then we probably would be on there. So, for example, like the doula program, we just can't, we're going to start an end-of-life doula program. It's not for credit. It's not for profit. It's not for credit. And it's in our workforce development, but they look for opportunities out there and then they'll develop a program.
Right, or the nurse practitioner role maybe, which is relatively new, which was really sort of developed.
No, these are doulas, who, you do not have to. And so it's a good, income, you can charge like $1,500 per family to be a doula. And so we can't, we just keep filling these classes. So, yeah.
Great. Other questions? Great, go ahead, Andy.
Hi. This question kind of mostly for Matt, but also kind of curious what other people think is this. So, you mentioned this kind of amazing thing that there's, like you said, that there's 3,000 positions that can't be filled in manufacturing right now. And I was wondering if you can expand on, what is it that can't be found right now? What is it that the employers are looking for that the current workforce is missing? Why isn't the workforce jumping to fill that? Like, what are the barriers to doing that? And is this something that, like, workforce training programs, like the kind we're talking about, you think could fill those gaps in a 6-month, 1-year background for somebody who doesn't necessarily have background in the field?
Well, the vast majority of these positions that are open are entry-level positions. There's a myriad of reasons why they can't be filled. I mean, oftentimes it's requiring that the person or the individuals that can take these positions never have marijuana in their system, or they can't have any drugs because they're working with heavy equipment. That's been an issue. I think something that's underreported is the gigification of our economy. I'll give you a perfect example. My son came home from college, and I asked if he wanted to take a job in manufacturing while he was home on break, and he said, I can average $25 an hour, basically going out before lunch or around lunchtime, delivering Uber Eats, and then come back, play Xbox in the afternoon, and then go out for dinner, do the exact same thing. And the gig economy has grown over 400% in the United States over the past several years, and there's an awful lot of people that are doing that. There's also a challenge around the way the jobs are structured. I have a company that I was talking to that has a 78% turnover rate in the first 90 days. And the reason being is that they have 12-hour shifts, and they are 7 days a week. And trying to get them to understand that maybe they need to rethink that structure is very difficult, because the way people want to work now, and I think what has happened since the pandemic, people have got a better understanding as to what a work-life balance is and how they would prefer to be employed has changed. It's not the way it used to be. You throw a job out and there would be a line at the door. I think that there's also a challenge demographically here in southwestern Pennsylvania. It's not that we're a growing population and we don't have the steady influx of immigration that some other regions have, where they can fill these positions in manufacturing, which is why you see companies looking to build new places in new factories in the South and other areas where there is that steady influx.
So one thing you highlight here is that that the local population is kind of has the opportunity to fill these, and the people who are qualified don't want to, because like even just driving for Uber is more lucrative. Should we think of these manufacturing jobs as like realistically opportunities for occupational and economic advancement for the local population? It sounds like local populations are seeing these as worse than driving for the gig economy or something like that. That's one way you could interpret what you're saying. And so the question is, should we be focused on manufacturing? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here. If the jobs that are being offered right now are not more exciting to workers than video games and the gig economy, and they can make a good living doing the latter.
Possibly, but I'd ask you to think about it this way. There's a company that started up recently called Variable, Veryable. They specialize in the gigification of the manufacturing sector, getting manufacturers to understand that what they can be doing is structuring their work a little bit differently and hiring gig workers to come in instead of working from 9 or 7 in the morning till 3. Maybe it's a mother that drops her child off at school in the morning and is now available from 10 until 2 and can be out there working on the floor, get out and be home in time to pick up her child. Manufacturing has to think a little bit differently about how they structure their jobs to identify that, I guess, individuals that will be a good fit for them.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much.
And we are also looking at that in healthcare, like, I give the example of my daughter. She's a biologist, was interviewing doctors to work as a research, work in a lab. And she interviewed the doctor. I thought, well, she's going for the job. I asked her, how is it going? She's like, oh, I don't want him. I said, well, why? She said, because he said I had to work from 8 to 4. And I said, oh, okay. So then she goes to the next doctor at the Pitt Medical School, and she interviewed him, and she came back and said, I took this job. And I said, well, why did you take the job? She said, well, he said I could come in at 7 and work to 12. Then I can go out and do what I need to do. Then I can come back in the evening at 5 o'clock and then do the job. And he said, so she said he got the job. She got the job, but basically she picked him. So I think we have to think more about that. I think Matt is right.
One other thing that manufacturers are starting to realize, there are manufacturers out there that don't have much of an issue, and it's because they have a great culture. You could walk out on the floor and you ask, would you recommend this as a place for your family and friends? And they would say yes. And those are the companies that don't have a challenge. So it's getting manufacturers to think that way. How can I create a culture? Maybe it's through an apprenticeship program with wage progression that keeps people there longer. Maybe it's because we have core values that not only do we post it on the wall, but we live by it. We don't have issues attracting diversity or diverse candidates because if you look in our C-suite, it's pretty diverse, right? So that they feel that they're welcome and they're part of the entire group. Those are the things that companies need to be focused on. And in doing that, creating that culture, you could have a really hard job, but love it because you love the people that you're with, because you have the same mission and vision and the core values that make it a place for you.
Those are great insights, and I think just like as a follow-up, so this is sort of like great advice, I think, for firms, right, and for employers. On the other side, and I get asked this question a lot when I'm on panels, and I never have an answer, so it's almost as bad as when my non-economist friends ask me for stock market advice. So, and this is what would be your advice to the young people, in terms of, okay, you want to have a sustainable long-term career path. Actually, in the conference earlier, David Deming, Harvard's David Deming said, well, the nice thing about people is they're general purpose technology, so they could do a lot of stuff, right? But like, what would be your advice? So let's say to your own kids or people who are currently studying or about to enter the labor market in whatever field you feel comfortable talking about. And yeah, I'd like to hear everyone's perspective, unless you.
I would say, I tell my kids, be a lifelong learner. Find what interests you and focus on that. Now, I'm not saying find your passion and that should be your career. I mean, I was just listening to Scott Galloway say something about that. Now, find what you're really good at and make that your career, because that will be your passion, because your passion should be taking care of your kids and your future and your wife and your home and all those things, right? So I tell my kids to find what interests you, what makes you want to learn more, what triggers that thing. It's just like when you had a teacher that you always connected with in school, it's because they had that one aspect that made you interested, that made you really successful in that class. It's the same with work, right? Is to find that path that interests you.
Okay, so be a lifelong learner.
Yep.
All right. Lisa, what do you think? John?
So I guess the one thing I say, and this relates a little bit to Krishna's question and the interaction with technology, is AI is different in some ways, but it's the same in some ways as like, what does technology do and how do you protect yourself from a job that technology can't come and destroy? And it's this idea that technology can substitute some tasks, complement other tasks. And still, what computers are very bad at is kind of the judgment and decision making and aggregating the information and making the call. So you can ask ChatGPT, like, what should I do with this like collage of information that I have, and it's going to spit back garbage at you, right? And so just finding a skill and a job that requires kind of deciding what to do, a lot of decision making and aggregation of information, those kinds of jobs are just like not going to disappear, because a machine is not going to be able to do that for a very long time period. And this has been true historically. AI is better at some of this stuff than technology was before. And so there are some jobs that were protected in the past, but may be disappearing. So like, for instance, one task, perhaps medical diagnosis is a task that we can have help from a machine to do. We may not need as many people, but we're still going to need people to decide what to do with that diagnosis and how to help people on a larger scale. And so that's what I tell people to make sure your job doesn't disappear, is just do something that I think machines won't be able to do for a long time.
If you're going to use that ChatGPT, whatever it's called, make sure, like if you're putting through a graduate application, that you don't get the same paragraph. We're finding, like, we have a friend who is a reviewer for a graduate program. She's found the same paragraphs in the essays, and so they said, well, we're going to just put through something through to just see if we can recreate it. So we are going to test it. So, but yeah, it's spitting out the same language.
All right, John, you have this tough question of.
I'll think about it in terms of my kids, and
Please.
I just try to encourage them to have a portfolio strategy. Like, I have no idea what skills they should have. I mean, I think what Lisa is talking about is right. Like, judgment is probably something that is really critical, and I don't know per se like how to develop that, but. I do think that probably having good judgment in some area probably means knowing how to do the thing yourself. So, I won't let my kids use like ChatGPT to write or do math. But what I'm trying to encourage them is to use these technologies as tutors, because, I mean, if you're not trying to cheat, they're amazing tools for teaching yourself things. And they're the most patient. They can meet you where you're at. They can explain things in different ways. So if we can harness that, I think that would be really phenomenal. I also I'm like to be optimistic here too. Obviously, job loss is terrible. Very depressing slide. We all know that how bad this is. I mean, a world where you do have technologies that can do lots and lots of things that right now are extremely expensive. Is a world where we're all collectively a lot wealthier. And so, maybe that's a world where maybe people work less. Like the stories of people like, hey, your son, like, man, maybe I'll do a little bit of driving, but I'm also going to have my free time. Like, you also have to admire that. Like,
Well, I was jealous, actually.
now it comes out. So, I think, right, I don't think that, like, we're free from labor, but at the same time, a world in which we're wealthier is a world where we can make more, like, leisure trade-offs, and maybe it's not so essential that, we're thinking about exactly how to have, 40 hours a week.
That's fantastic. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We're sort of nearing the end of our time, so I think that's a great place to sort of end our conversation. I'm also really excited for these agents, especially if they can also do my laundry and my dishes and stuff, so keep me posted on that.
They don't have hands.
Yeah, I think that's... So I want to thank our panelists, our wonderful audience, also the online audience, and of course the Block Center for putting everything together, for organizing everything, for facilitating this entire conference and this conversation. Thank you all, and have a great day.